Listening to the Habitology podcast with Melanie White, and today I am talking with Jenny Keaty about the Myers-Briggs personality test. And Jenny, I'm so thrilled you're here, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Hi, well, thanks, Mel. Thanks for having me. My name's Jenny Keaty, as Mel said. I've been around the coaching and the training field probably now for about 25 years, and have probably always just been fascinated in what makes people tick. And that's obviously why training and the coaching are a natural sort of fit. But then you go deeper and you think sort of, what is it that makes individuals tick? It's easy to see behaviours, but go, what's going on beneath the scenes? So I've actually been quite attracted to a lot of different tools over my time. Myers-Briggs being a key one of them, astrology sometimes, the DISC model, 4 tendencies. There's all sorts of things that just can help us understand ourselves and understand others. So all this comes together really nicely in terms of what I do and coaching as well.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think you raised an important point of this curiosity about ourselves and people. And we know that the first condition of change is self-awareness. So the more awareness we have, theoretically, the easier it is for us to take the first step toward change.
Yeah, and I think this is so important both as a coach, but also understanding our client. But we've got to know ourselves first. And I think quite often when we start coaching, we've got our head full of trying to work out what's going on for the client, but it really makes it easier if we can have that awareness of ourselves, and that will help us appreciate the differences in other people as well.
So, Jenny, on that note, can you tell us a little bit about the Myers-Briggs test and how we can use it to understand ourselves better?
Okay. So I guess first up, the Myers-Briggs test has been around for a long time. It was based on the work of Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist who did a lot of work around different behaviours. And then there was a mother and daughter team who used the work of Carl Jung to sort of put this together into what we now know as the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's quite complex in terms of to be really accredited to use the tool effectively. It's almost like a university semester of training. It's quite intense, but there's some psychological principles that's been around for a long time. But I guess what I want to say, there's about 3 layers of this. It is a very complex tool, so it's not just for everybody. However, you can use it in a more simplified way. I think the key thing is with any of these tools, what we want to do is, coming back to your word curiosity, we want to be curious. We want to see what is it that this tool provides that might help me in terms of my own awareness, or might help me when I'm working with clients. So, for example, what I like about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, it looks at, like, there's 16 different aspects to it, so which come through in 4 different scales. And those scales just provide a little bit more depth to the person, what energizes them, whether they're energized internally or whether they're energized by the external world, how they think, how they make decisions, how they approach life. So it's just got a few more layers to it than some of the other tools, and hence probably why it's quite involved to formally learn how to do it. But I also believe that if you've got an understanding of some of this, you can use it in a more simplified way. And often we've used that in training just to get people to self-assess, giving them some descriptions of some of those 4 scales and letting them choose where they think they might fit.
So different levels at which you can use it, and obviously that deep study that you can do. And actually, speaking of that, I'm curious to know, when you did that training, what sort of insights did you get about yourself?
Oh, well, I think it's one of the things, and it's funny how I come back to this. This was actually in the training itself, and what they did, they'd asked us a few different questions, and then they put us into tables of sort of like-minded people. And I always remember they gave an example of, being at uni or a university assessment or an assignment that was due. And I think when you're in a training environment and you're sort of around sort of like-minded people, it's just interesting how it brings out the norms. So, for example, there was one particular table, and I'm not making any confession at this stage, there was one particular table who were the people who left it till the last minute. You know, they got energized by that last minute rush to the finishing line. And that was the norm. And you could see this table all sort of laughing and, you know, really relating to that. And then there was another table that were totally stressed out at the thought of it. Oh, no, how could you possibly do that? They were the sort of people who got the university assignment and started mapping it out, you know, step by step by step. And couldn't possibly wait till the last moment because of the stress of that would absolutely destroy them. And yeah, just seeing that in two tables, like I had a bit of a chuckle to myself. And I'm not going to admit which table I was on, but you probably will know. It's possibly that we would have both been on different tables in that example as well. But what I also thought was the interesting insight from that was, even though those people did leave things to the last minute, you know, it's easy for people to judge and go, oh, they're slack, or, you know, they're out partying, or make judgments and assessments. But the thing that really stood out for me is that even though they might leave the action, they're often thinking about it. So it's not like they're not doing anything, but it doesn't appear that they're doing anything.
They're
Whereas the other
processing
table, were very methodical. You know, it was part of their schedule. It was a priority. It was fascinating just to see. And just one little example. And but also what I really took out of that was that when you're on that table of the last minute people, you know, that camaraderie that you had, because everyone felt normal, they were like you. And yet the people on the other table, that was the same effect. They were having that, this isn't right, this feels normal, we get one another. So it sort of highlights that sometimes we can think that, you know, we're right and they're wrong, or the other way around, where really it's just appreciating differences. And I always remember at the time I was doing a lot of training, and I used it not from a coaching point of view at that stage, as a training tool with different groups in the workplace. And I always remember a group of receptionists we had at one stage, and the insight that they got was amazing, because suddenly these people that were ringing up weren't these grumpy clients. They suddenly realized that these were just people that maybe were different than them. So I think that's where it's just so valuable, that once we understand that we're not all the same, you know, we can then appreciate some of those differences, and then we can go to another layer and say, well, what are those differences, and how can I work with those to bring the best out of both of us in this particular situation? And that's why I think the true value is, it's not about labeling somebody and saying you're this and you're that. You know, the other part of Myers-Briggs that I really think is nice, we use all those preferences. We use all those preferences, but we just have a natural one. So it's a bit like being a left-hander or a right-hander. If you're naturally right-handed, that's going to feel easier for you. And yet if you break your right hand, yes, you can certainly learn to use your left hand, but it's never going to feel quite the same. And I think with the MBTI preferences, it's a little bit similar. We've all got a bit of each of it in us, but there will be a more natural preference. But also, and this is a lot more involved and more than we need to for today, there is a whole developmental phase that goes with this. So even if you start out more extroverted, as you get older, that sort of introversion side will sort of start to strengthen. So I see a lot of people who say, oh, I used to be an extrovert, but now I'm an introvert. No, you haven't actually changed. You're just strengthening or developing that introversion aspect of yourself.
I was going to ask you about that, how people's scores change over time, and that's a great example of a shift. And you're saying it's not necessarily a change, but a focusing on a different area.
Yeah, and as I said, it's quite complex, and it's not something, I mean, I'm familiar with it, but not sort of, you know, not in terms of sort of sharing it fully. There is a whole developmental phase. So in our early stage, we'd have a dominant function, we have a tertiary function. We've got different functions that will come to the fore at different stages of our life. Most people who do any research in this area will say some of these natural preferences usually come through when we're younger. And that's what we grow up with. That's what we get used to. But as we, you know, and also I believe that as we age, we gain experience, we gain wisdom sometimes, you know, we get to be familiar with those different preferences. But yeah, it's a little bit like the strength survey and other tools. It's not that you lose them, you just have more of a focus on different areas at different times. So, for example, I was always very high on the extroversion scale. I'm nowhere near that high on that extroversion scale now, but I still, at my core, I'm more of an extrovert than an introvert. And I think that's a fascinating one, and maybe we can just have a quick look at that as a scale. So if that's okay.
Yeah.
So this is taking a really simple look at it, and because the scale, extroversion, introversion. So on one end, you've got the extroversion, on the other end, you've got introversion. And it's not, you won't be one or the other, you'll be somewhere along that scale. But people often misunderstand what that is. So this particular scale is looking at where you get your energy from, what energizes you. It's not whether you're the life of the party as such. But the key difference here is that somebody who's more on the extroversion side of that scale are going to be someone who's energized by other people. They get that energy from their outer world, by people, by activities. Whereas an introversion is probably, that's more likely to get that energy from within. They need to sort of go within to sort of recharge. They're the sort of people who need time to think about things. They need time to reflect. They'll think first and then they'll act later. Whereas an extrovert might, and I'm talking extremes here because we're going to be in various sort of stages of it. An extroversion might act and then think later. So you can already see just on that particular scale what that influence could be. And especially as a coach, if you're somebody who is very extroverted, for example, and you're working with someone who is more introverted, you could be getting impatient thinking, come on, talk, come on, Or on the other hand, and I think this is another key sort of thing just to add in, when we get stressed, we're more likely to revert back to what that natural preference is. So for example, if I was more extroverted and I'm feeling stressed because I'm working with a new client who is very different, I'm likely to become even more extroverted. I'm likely to talk faster. I'm likely to rush things. And just simple little things like that can make such a difference. And you can see the impact that could have on a conversation.
I've just actually recorded 2 podcasts on introvert coaches and extrovert coaches, funnily enough. Yeah. And it's interesting you're talking about you being very extroverted and being less so now. I started life as extremely introverted. Like I was terrified of speaking. I didn't want people to see me eating in public, all sorts of things that I would just sit silently and not want people to look at me. As a kid, I was extremely introverted. And I actually think I've become more extroverted as I've gotten older, probably getting rid of fears and anxieties along the way and doing a lot of work. I'm on the borderline. I'm probably what they call the ambivert, but I'm just on the I side. I'm curious on your thoughts on that too.
Well, my thing, I would say you're always the introvert, and I mean from this perspective, always got that as a natural preference. But the reality is, the extroversion would probably be your tertiary function, and it's now coming to the fore. It's now its turn to stand up and be recognised. And I think the other thing is, it's really important to think that just because you're extrovert or introvert doesn't mean to say you can't do either. And I often share an example of my sister, and this could also apply equally to you, given the understanding we have of each other. And my sister, like you, does a lot of training. She does a lot of coaching, and she's out there. She can be out there on stage. She can be running training courses and all day talking to people. But at the end of the day, she needs her cave time, as we call it. She needs to withdraw. And the thing is, if she doesn't, she can burn out really quickly. Whereas an extrovert could have all that happen and be totally revved up and charged and just want more of that. So, does that make sense for you there, Mel?
Oh, absolutely. And as you're talking and about the concept of energy and managing energy, I've realized that my secret formula is to start and finish the day with reading. I wake up in the morning, normally a bit before Jay, pick up my Kindle and read for half an hour, and I'm ready to go because I've done that internal something for me thing. I don't need to go and talk to people, but I get that and I get energized from doing that. And at the end of the day, I must read at least 1 page before I go to bed. There's something about that helps me to calm down my nervous system, get into my body.
And
really.
that's such a classic example, isn't it? What you can do with that awareness. Once you've got that awareness, you can make choices that serve you and allow your strengths to sort of come out when they need to be. So there are times when you need to be out there and doing your thing. But if you don't take that time, as you're saying, at either end of the day or whenever that happens to be, to recharge, it's like, I just recently saw a quote on Facebook only earlier today, and it said something like, some of us have to sort of, step back to or quieten down to recharge, and others don't get that. So it's a classic example of knowing what it is that we need to, where we get that energy from. And that's just one scale. But I think it's also important, like I gave that example with my sister and with you, there's a lot of comedians and actors that are actually introvert, and yet we think because they're on stage that they are extrovert. So this is why it's important not to judge. It's just to be open to different styles. But I think one of the things, well, just while we're on this scale too, is that there's probably people are more familiar with extroverts out there. That's what they see. So often I see introverts feeling less than, feeling lacking in confidence. And I remember coaching a lovely girl one time, and she was an extreme introvert, and part of what we were doing was just her getting to know her better and how to use her sort of strengths. And I remember it was such an aha moment, and it was beautiful, both of us. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And she just stopped and she said, "Thank you. This is the first time I have ever felt proud to be an introvert." And it's the sort of thing that we really got to watch, so we don't give ourselves a hard time, understanding ourselves and how we can use our strengths. But suddenly, when we were talking through these different things, she could see that it was okay to be an introvert. And not only that, it was when she actually accepted her introversion in that sort of context, that she could really be herself. And that's when she started to shine. And that was just so powerful as a conversation. And that's just one scale. That's not looking at how all these others sort of fit in. Do you want to have a look at some of the other scales, just out of curiosity?
Absolutely.
So the second scale is that one of how we gather information. So you've got your sensing versus your intuition. So a sensor is really going to need to have the facts and the details. They need to see it, touch it, feel it. Is it real? They're not the sort of people who can just trust their gut necessarily. They're not the sort of people who can just wing it, because they need that sort of
hard data,
tangible sort of stuff that's there.
proof.
Give me the proof. Whereas somebody like the intuition type sort of person, they're going to trust their gut. They're going to have this connection with their heart, perhaps. Maybe their I don't want to mix it up with the next sort of category, but maybe their values come to the fore. They're guided by that sort of inner part, as opposed to the evidence. The sense is going to be quite sort of methodical. They need to, And this is really interesting, because we know that when we talk about coaching and we're working with a client and creating a vision can be a very intuitive process if it's done well. And yet, if you think about a sensor perhaps not being able to see into the future, we've got to really think about the language we use and how we can help somebody who is a sensor sort of get some of that concrete information with a concept that's not concrete. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And as you're speaking, I'm wondering if that kind of shows up in the words that a client might use. For example, the S might have very different language about more tangible things that they want to achieve versus the N, the intuitive person.
Yeah, so it's just sort of thing, just to bear in mind that it doesn't say we shouldn't be doing a vision, but our language is a really good way of communicating with people.
Are you an S or an N, Jenny?
Me?
Yeah.
What do you think?
N.
Very much an N, yeah. And it's interesting, because when we used to do this sort of webinar, like every time I'd go through certain characteristics, it's just like, yes, okay. Now, like, it was even just reminding me even more, even though I wrote the webinar and I knew what I was sort of saying, it was just like, that is so me. That is so me. And I think that's the thing. It's not about it being good or bad. It's just about you. And when you understand you, then you can use your strengths to your advantage.
For example,
And help others.
knowing how to trust yourself,
It
because
is.
you know that intuition is a strength of yours, versus knowing, okay, I need some facts in order to make a decision. So
Yeah.
making a decision, your approach to making that decision might be very different.
And I think just picking up on that theme, as we said, with experience with age and different developmental phases, we're obviously using all of those sort of preferences. But can you see that, the other thing that the intuitor does is be able to think big picture.
Yeah.
And can you see without that big picture, some of the detail doesn't matter? And the same in reverse. If there's a time and a place where you do need to sort of come down from the helicopter view and focus on that nitty gritty, but you need both. Yeah.
And that kind of leads into perhaps where your client might need support. If they're very big picture, they might struggle with the details or the planning or the concrete actions. And someone that's very, I need a tangible thing, might find it hard to see where it's all going, perhaps.
Yeah. And it is interesting because I think it is the combination of all of them, because at one stage I was sort of thinking, if you can see big picture, but are you taking the steps you need to do? And again, coming back to a model that we're both using a lot, is that, maybe the intuitor is good at the vision, but are they good at taking the action? And there might be other things that would influence that. So I don't want to overgeneralize, but it is getting that image of both. Now, the third scale, just as, again, I want to separate these two things, is how people make decisions. So again, that's an interesting one. Do you do it from a head perspective, or do you do it from a heart perspective? So that's the scale, the thinkers versus the feelers. Now, it doesn't mean to say if you're a thinker, you don't feel, and it doesn't mean to say if you're a feeler, you don't think. But generally, the thinker is going to be more logical. It's going to be more factual. It's the pros and cons. It's sort of, it's cut to the chase. Whereas the feeler's going to really start looking at the personal implications of that. How does that impact on the people? They're concerned about making the right decision that's going to sort of, I don't know, not just please people, but it's going to be in the interests of the people, if that makes sense. So they are interested in people. You could say the thinkers at that stage are more interested in the facts or the process or the outcome. So again, it's the sort of thing that there doesn't tend to be the extremes in this thinking and feeling scale. People can sort of hover a bit around the middle. And I've also found it over the time that sometimes your work roles can influence if you're doing, like I was very strong on the feeling side, but in a role one time when I was doing a lot of policy work, the thinking was sort of taking, more of a priority there. So again, it's just showing you differences, but it's the fact that it's the way you think about something. So I know you've shared some things. Would you like to sort of share how, given what I've just said about that scale, how that applies to you?
Yeah, I'm T. In fact, for all of mine, I'm very close to the middle of each of these scales, funnily enough. I'm either side of the middle, and I think I'm just on the thinking side. And probably having my first career as a scientist, I intuitively did things and made decisions, but I definitely thought through things and made decisions based on fact, or did things based on a structure. I tend to be very structured.
Yep.
Feeling, not so much, funnily enough.
Yeah. But again, I think like the extroversion, introversion, it doesn't mean to say you can't do those things. You've got those things and they will play out in different ways. But at the same time, your natural preference is to sort of think more logically, more based on facts, what's fair. It's sort of, it's the strength of that is it can be quite impartial. It can, because it's not getting caught up in the emotion of something. So there's going to be more positive aspects and sort of less positive aspects of all of these sort of things. So again, it's not about judging, it's just showing that range and how that might apply both to ourselves first. And I still come back to, if we know it in ourselves first, and then those people around us, it's a lot easier than we work with somebody else.
And also thinking about how that shows up in coaching. For example, I find it easy to be unattached to the other person's outcome. I don't lie awake at night thinking about all these poor people that I've coached. And you know, I care about them, but
I know.
I'm not taking on that energy. I can have that clear separation. And I always thought, what is that? Do I lack empathy, or what? Why is it that I'm like that? But perhaps it's because I'm in that thinking mode, and
Possibly. And maybe you're compartmentalizing. And again, I'm much better at that now than I used to be. So whether that's a developmental phase, whether that's my, one of those sort of tertiary functions, it's sort of kicking in as well. But I think the point there to stress is it doesn't mean to say you don't care about your clients. You definitely care about them, but you're compartmentalizing. You're a lot more rational and logical in your thinking. So it is up to them. And that's what coaching is all about.
and the intuitive part still allows you to have that connection. You can feel in your body where somebody else has got that tension, and to notice that, I think, brings in some of that empathy and that relational side of the.
Yeah. But as we said, each of the scales and each of the sort of particular ends of the scales are going to have their strengths and weaknesses. So somebody who is a coach who is overly invested in the feeling side of things is never going to be able to make the tough calls that sometimes we need to make as a coach. You need to have that courage to sort of challenge or to call a client if we're to do the job. And if you're too worried about what they're thinking about you, or whether you're making them happy or not, I mean, they're not paying you to make them happy as such, but it doesn't mean to say we don't care and we don't want the best for our client, but we want the best for our client by helping them be the best version of themselves, so that they can sort of be aligned.
Jenny, are you on the thinking or the feeling side? Where are you on that scale?
On the feeling side. But I'm more thinking these days. But it's not that more thinking. I'm always got the feeling side, but I'm hovering more, closer to the middle on that one than any of the other scales. So yeah. But again, the awareness you have knows that you can use both when it's appropriate to use both. So put me with my 7-year-old grandson, and I'm all feeling. No, not really. I would also have thinking aspects of that just because of the logistics. But again, certain situations will bring out that. But I do think that at times, we see a lot of people through the training we do that, people come into coaching because they want to help. And sometimes people think that they want to help by being nice to people. And that's not necessarily the best thing for the client or for the coach. You can burn out very quickly if your feeling meter is running high.
And I wonder if that ties into compassion fatigue, someone who's very high on the F.
Yeah, it certainly could. Again, that's why we need that awareness to sort of work out if that's the case. Now, just that last scale, just so we can sort of put the picture together, is that how you approach your life. And you've got your judging versus your perceiving. And I know judging is one of those words when it comes to sort of coaching, but in this context, judging is you're planning your work, you're sort of on track, you're scheduling, you enjoy finishing and seeing completion, you feel that work comes before play, you want routine, all those things. Do they sound familiar, Mel?
Yes. Organisation, clarity, compartmentalization.
Again, and there is some, it'll seem a little bit similar, but it's not than the previous one, because this is how you approach your life versus the other one was how you make the decisions.
I think this is about, to me, I use the word discernment. It's about being discerning with how you spend your time.
Exactly. But it's also what I find, what I tend to see in this is that people who have that J preference, they are more structured, they are more routine. There is a time factor. There's a sign on, a sign off type of thing. It's a lot more, but it's not a bad thing, because those people have their schedule organized in a way that allows them to do the work that they need to do.
As long as you don't cling on to it with white knuckles.
Yeah, that's different. Or expect that everybody else works the same way is what I would add to that one. Whereas the people on the other side, they're what they're calling the perceiving end of the scale. These people are sort of, go with the flow, take on whatever's going on at the time. They enjoy starting things, but not necessarily finishing things. They, they feel that play and work coexist together. It's like, what gets my attention? Oh, boom, off and doing that. They solve problems as they arise. They're not, and again, there's a time and a place when that works really well, but they're available for whatever's best for them at the time. And they're probably not going to have a routine to that extent. They probably want to be able to be seeing what happens, what works best for them on the given day. They like the spontaneity. That's probably what it is there, the spontaneity versus the sort of certainty of knowing sort of what's going on. But as I said, if you put this under the banner of that's a general approach to life, the judging part of the scale, you set your watch, you have a meeting at a certain time, they'll be there on time. The perceiving end, oh yeah, that's right, I've got a meeting on. They're the ones who, I know I've got a sister who we used to say we must tell her half an hour that we're starting half an hour earlier so she would be there. Like if we had a 10 o'clock meeting, we'd say to her, we've got to be there at 9:30 because that way she might have arrived by 10 o'clock. So can you see the differences in those two?
I have that sister.
Yeah.
Jenny, I'm struggling to see which one of those you are, because I know that you like spontaneity, but I also know that you like order.
Yeah, I'm the P. I'm the P. But I think it is, I like the spontaneity, but I do believe we all need a little bit of routine. And it's interesting because I would rarely ever be late. I'm not a late person, even though I'm a P. So this is why we've got to just not generalize, but look at those general characteristics.
Where does it show up? Yeah.
But it is interesting because I think that personally I like the spontaneity, but I also know that my body responds well to some kind of routine. So ideally, we've got those 4 scales, and what will happen is we'll either have a natural preference for one end or the other, and the idea is we'll end up with a 4-letter code, which will become our type. And I think what I really like, even just doing a self-assessment, you can work out what you might be. You can have a look at the descriptions of the ones around you. It's, you don't need a system telling you what you are. Have a look at those and see what resonates for you. And that's enough awareness to get started. So you've got that self-awareness option, keeping it simple versus doing a more formal questionnaire, which is only going to give you feedback on what you've put into it. And I do believe that you do gain a lot if you do a formal one by having somebody who is skilled to help you understand it. I see a lot of people get information and then they run off saying, oh, I'm a this, but they don't really understand what that means for them or, anybody else. But people generally love finding out about themselves.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into, I suppose, the last part of this conversation is how does a coach who chooses to study this or use this as a basic tool, how do they use that to add value to the coaching session? And I suppose part of that answer is it's a self-awareness tool that allows people to understand how and why they operate, which helps them to make perhaps decisions about parts of their life. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a tool. It's a tool like anything else. And the power of the tool is in how you use it. Like it's not the sort of thing you start your first session and then you throw out all your tools and go there and do it. I think you've just got to trust yourself and look at, what's going to add value to the session. First and foremost, as a coach, I think the more of this we can do, the better, because the better we understand ourselves, the better we understand people that we're working with. And you and I have both shared some examples this morning where, we can see it in others. We can see our sister who might have a different sort of quality or preference to us. And I think that's the thing. As a coach, as an individual, how does this apply to me? How can I see differences in people around me? And then what might this mean for me when I start to work with a new client who I'm maybe less familiar with? You can ask and you can sort of get a bit of a sense just from some of the questions. As you've also said, using language, using a variety of language in the way you talk to your client to try and sort of get a bit of an understanding about them. What do they like to do at the end of a busy day? Do they like to go and party? Do they like to go and, retreat and read a book or sort of have cave time, as I described? Just some of those things will help you understand your client. You don't need them to do a formal, assessment. If over the time you feel that, something else like that would work, well, again, come down to you as a coach and what are your skills and your background. If this is your first exposure, you don't go and get somebody to do a full MBTI process because you wouldn't, as a coach, be able to guide them through the next steps. you
Mm.
may be better off using something like the Strength Survey or Gretchen
Yeah.
Rubin's 4 Tendencies. But if you are familiar with this and you do want to know more about it, there's a lot of good resources out there. And you and I can both provide support in terms of that. But I think the key is it's an awareness tool. It's helping them understand themselves. When they understand themselves, they get a greater appreciation of their strengths, like I shared with that client that I'd worked with.
Mm.
And then when they do that, I see that a lot of the things that we do in the coaching, can come to the fore. Like, for example, coming back to that example, the introvert, she was wanting to be setting up a coaching business, and there was the thought of going into an existing practice and running some talks, and she was very comfortable in that sort of clinic environment, but the thought of presenting and being out in front, so we talked through different ways that using her strength, she could, was it the best way for her to work?
Mm.
But if it wasn't, what other ways she could do that were more in alignment with her? So I think it's that idea that, there's always more than one way to skin a cat, that horrible saying. But I think the things that are important is that when we have that understanding of ourselves, it helps the way we communicate, it helps the way we relate to other people. And the two areas that tend to cause the most problems is around communication and is around our relationships with people. Coaching is all about communication and relationships with people, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if we understand ourselves better, we can then think, how can we communicate with others to bring out the best in them? And isn't that what coaching is all about? Bringing out the best in another person. But if we've got to be aware that when we get stressed, what happens? Those natural preferences come to the fore, which can conflict with communication and relationships.
Yeah. It's so true. And another thing that I think I got as an overarching flavour of this conversation is that a test like this creates perspective of yourself and others, and it might also generate acceptance of yourself and others, and perhaps some level of tolerance. So that awareness of yourself and others and the differences can actually help you be a more accepting and tolerant person, perhaps. And you gave a couple of examples of that with, I think you mentioned some admin staff or reception staff that had done this test and realised that they weren't awful customers, they were just different.
Yeah. And I think, as I said, you can look at that within your immediate family and the circle of friends. So it's not like you have to be having clients to be able to do this. And if you can see that in action, and I think it allows you to be less judgmental, which is also what we want in terms of coaching, more accepting. But I think it also helps you diversify the way you work to reflect, like any of us who are doing training and coaching, we want the best for the people we're working with. We can't do that if we can't do the best for ourselves too. I'll just add that little bit in there. That's that reminder that it's an ongoing thing, isn't it? We're all a work in progress. But I think if we can help our clients shine naturally, they're going to feel more empowered to take the action that they need to take. And I think that's the thing. It is a tool. It's not about labeling people. And I think that's one really strong point. You don't need to have the tool to sort of increase your awareness of other people, but these tools really do give you some deeper insight. And I like how you asked right at the beginning, what were my insights when I did it? So sometimes just those insights help you, learn and grow and flourish as well, don't they?
Yeah.
So really powerful. People love finding out about themselves.
They do.
And I think it is a great, some of these tools are fabulous tools to support that. But obviously then as a coach, it's what do we do with that information to sort of help people move forward, including ourselves.
Jenny, thanks so much for your time today. It's a really interesting conversation. I love how you unpacked those 4 levels, and hopefully people listening to this have got some great insights about how they can better understand themselves and also how they can perhaps look at a client's strengths in a different way. So I really appreciate you going through that in detail, and this is a juicy episode that I can't wait to share.
And there's so much we could talk all day on this, couldn't we?
I know. I'm already thinking of 100 other things. I thought, okay.
That's right. Put it back in its little box compartment.
We'll have a part 2.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Wonderful.
Thanks, Jen.
Jill.